IQs. Although parents pass on a random half of their genes to their offspring, they cannot pass on the particularly combinations of genes that cause their own exceptionality of the population or race at large. Genetic theory predicts the magnitude of the regression effect to be smaller the closer the degree of kinship between the individuals being compared, e.g., identical twin, full sibling, or parent-child, half-sibling. Culture-only theory makes no systematic or quantitative predictions. For any trait, scores should move toward the average for that population. So in the United States, genetic theory predicts that the children of black parents of IQ 115 will regress toward the black IQ average of 85, whereas children of white parent of IQ 115 will regress toward white IQ average of 100. Similarly, children of black parents of IQ 70 should move up toward the black IQ average of 85, whereas children of white parents of IQ 70 should move up toward the white IQ average of 100. I hope you understand the relevance of this, because when we look at races and populations, it's important to take in consideration that the exceptions at both ends of the race, the members of a race with low IQ and the members of a race with high IQ, their offspring will regress toward the racial mean. So the racial characteristics is something that it consists in the gene pool of the group as a whole, and the exceptionalities are thusly not very relevant to consider. Poor whites will eventually produce offspring that regress toward the mean, and they will thus be indistinguishable, and this same thing applies for the members of the white race with higher IQ. So it's important to consider race, not the individual exceptions or individuals with high IQ. Now, this hypothesis has been tested and the predictions confirmed. Regression would explain why black children born to high IQ wealthy black parents have test scores 2 to 4 points lower than do white children born to low IQ poor white parents. Did you hear what I said there? Listen again. Regression would explain why black children born to high IQ wealthy black parents, alright? Black children born to high IQ wealthy black parents have test scores 2 to 4 points lower than do white children born to low IQ poor white parents. So low IQ poor white parents produce children whose IQ is 2 to 4 points higher compared to the children of wealthy, intelligent blacks. Alright, so this is why it's important to consider regression to the mean. And reference Jensen 1998, B, page 358, Jensen 1973, pages 107 to 119. They tested the regression predictions with data from siblings, 900 white sibling pairs, and 500 black sibling pairs. These provide an even better test than parent-offspring comparisons, because siblings share very similar environments. Black and white children matched for IQ had siblings who had regressed approximately halfway to their respective population means rather than to the mean of the combined population. For example, when black children and white children were matched with IQs of 120, the siblings of black children averaged close to 100, whereas the siblings of white children averaged close to 110. Okay? So a reverse effect was found with children matched at the lower end of the IQ scale. When black children and white children are matched for IQs of 70, the siblings of the black children averaged about 78. So they regress upward from 70 to 78, whereas the siblings of the white children averaged about 85. So whites went from 70 to 85. It jumps much further. Because it regressed back to 100. Whilst blacks' IQ regressed much slower, from 70 to 78, compared to whites to 85. So the regression line showed no significant departure from linearity throughout the range of IQ from 50 to 150, as predicted by genetic theory, but not by culture-only theory. As a real-life reference, we have whites from families with incomes of less than $10,000 had a mean SAT score of 980. This is 123 points higher than the national mean for all blacks. Okay, so poor whites score higher than the average blacks. Whites from families with incomes below $10,000 had a mean SAT score that was 46 points higher than blacks whose families had incomes between $80,000 or $100,000. Alright, so poor whites score even higher, 46 points higher than blacks earn a lot more money. Blacks from families with incomes of more than $100,000 had a mean SAT score that was 142 points below the mean score for whites from families at the same income level, which we would expect. So the point is that heritable traits, be it physical, superficial, or behavioral, regress towards the mean, regress towards a gene pool's mean. And since the gene pools differ, members of different gene pools regress differently, creating a sort of status quo of racial behavioral traits. So it's necessary to consider the race as a whole, racial aggregates, because the individual exceptions will eventually anyway regress towards the mean of the gene pool. So the racial differences in behavior, the ones that could be argued are heritable, create a form of more or less immutable or immalleable group personality, racial culture of sorts, that changes how societies look like. So some statist white nationalists are, aside from the aesthetic reasons why they're interested in white nationalism, also, or perhaps even primarily, interested in the level of civilization they'll leave behind themselves. And they look at the different racial aggregates and behaviors and so forth, and that poor whites outperform wealthier whites, or that whites with low IQ produce children whose IQ regress upwards. And knowing that they cannot have a first-hand experience, okay? Knowing that they cannot have a first-hand experience with each and every member of the society or civilization they take part of, they therefore value the racial differences and look to race when they decide what society they would like to take part of in aiding its continuation, where they would like to see their descendants grow up and so forth. They look at the racial differences. They look to race, not to individual merit, because individual merit, which within a few generations will be reduced through regression to the mean, to racial aggregates anyways. So since we aren't autonomous individuals in a society, but we live in a society where how other people are and act is going to have an impact on our lives, we need to consider groups. We need to consider group personalities, not only individual personalities. Certain cultures are dependent on a certain level of IQ, to name one of the factors that impact a society and a civilization. If I value a certain culture that is dependent on a certain level of IQ, then taking in consideration what people has the preconditioned IQ for the existence and maintenance of the valued culture is going to be a precondition if I wish to preserve and enhance that culture or civilization. This video is already too long, and I intend to merely give people an insight into the white nationalist perspective. If you want to have the view argued that racial inequality isn't down to past or present discrimination, then there's an excellent book called Why Race Matters by Michael Levine, or you could purchase The Bell Curve or The G Factor by Arthur Jensen, or you could look at Some of French Elements YouTube's on the matter, or another user, KKilo34, which makes videos showing that blacks aren't presently discriminated against. Or you could watch some of my videos on race and IQ. But the topic is not to be argued in this video, and as such, I will proceed. Now, I genuinely and honestly do not enjoy talking about this race and IQ stuff. But I feel I have to talk about this because the claims made against whites are wrong and unfair. We do not talk about race and IQ or race and achievement because it makes us feel good to push people down and thereby feel elevated ourselves. This theory is wrong. That is not why we talk about this.
And I'll link to a post that shows that IQ does matter. As bad as Anubis' reasoning is, he at least appears to understand that yes, IQ does measure something meaningful, and people with higher IQs, ceteris paribus, have better results in life. And lastly, I just want to justify why I talk about race and IQ as much as I do, even though I don't really talk about it that much. In fact, it's been responding to Anubis that I've actually been talking about the most. But the issue has to do with equality being used as a political weapon. Because if we assume that all racial groups are of equal innate intelligence, then this means that outcome differences between the groups is a result not of anything innate, but is caused by environment or discrimination, right? Or something nefarious. And this line of reasoning is then used to justify greater taxation and institutional racial discrimination against whites. Right? The assumption of equality between groups has profoundly negative political consequences.
We don't talk about race and IQ because it is fun or it makes us feel empowered. Quite on the contrary. It is honestly quite disgusting, in my opinion, to have to talk about it. But it has to be talked about because of the accusations against whites, which are unfair and untrue. The topic of racial variation is admittedly disturbing, and in an ideal world might be passed over in silence, but accusations against whites have made such discretion impossible. The right of the accused to present his case includes the right to raise issues that distress his accuser. A plaintiff demanding damages for a broken leg cannot ask at the same time that his leg not be talked about, nor take offense when the defendant presents evidence that the injury was congenital. By claiming harm, he opens the question of why his leg is game. Claiming racial harm has opened the topic of race differences. The problem is that the inequality between the races is being excused incorrectly as being the fault of whites because of historical persecution and oppression and present discrimination. It is whites' faults, and therefore whites should pay, the saying goes. The racial inequality is excused to set up big intervening governments and institutionalize anti-white racism to import non-whites that create democratic voting wars where the non-whites vote themselves the resources of whites, i.e. steal them via government's monopoly on force to advance their own communities' agendas. From a white nationalist perspective, and I'm sure quite many others who sympathize and share this perspective on the matter without being white nationalists, it is a form of moderate oppression of whites, and we think this isn't right. It isn't fair. It isn't justice. The whole concept of the inequality being based upon white historical and present discrimination is a false one, based upon false assumptions and faulty evidence. That is why we talk about race and IQ. We talk about it from a defensive viewpoint. The present racial inequality is also used as a justification not only of theft of white resources, but as a justification of why freedom of association ought to be restricted and whites ought to be bound to non-whites until there is a racial equality and whites have paid off their alleged debt. The problem is, we think racial equality never is going to happen. The only thing that is going to happen is that we are going to be dragged down as more wealth is going to get stolen and as more racial privileges are going to be granted to them by the government. That is our honest belief.